Christ, I need a haircut. Hello, Jacksonites, and welcome to a double feature of reviews tonight. Um, I just got some extra spare time, and of course, I'm in a horror movie mood, so why the hell not? Today, right now, I will be reviewing another one of my favorite horror movies, and one that I totally forgot about when I did my original top 20 horror movie video. The 1988 remake of The Blob. Oh boy, this is a good one. Though similar to Fright Night, I don't have a whole lot of nostalgia for this movie. And while I've seen this movie more than twice, I still haven't seen it that many times. But I have seen the original Blob movie from 1958. And I actually remember not really digging it all that much. Though actually my origin of the Blob comes once again from James Rolfe. Not from Monster Madness, but James Rolfe did just a 3-part retrospective series about alien invader films from the 50s and comparing them to their remakes. He compared The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Thing, Earth versus the Flying Saucers, which that's the only one that doesn't really have a direct remake, but Independence Day and Mars Attacks are very similar to that film. War of the Worlds, Invaders from Mars. I think there was 3 in the last. Invasion of the Body Snatchers and The Blob. I think that's all of them. I haven't seen that retrospective in a long time, but I think the last one that he did for that series was The Blob. And that's the one that really intrigued me the most, aside from The Thing and War of the Worlds. And yeah, that was my origin for it. I remember actually being really intrigued by the 50s version, partially because it was a 50s sci-fi movie that was in color, and that really stuck out to me because I always thought I was still very new to black and white and color films in the 50s, so the fact that it was in color intrigued me. And the theme song, Beware of the Blob theme song. So 3 or 4 years later, when I was living with my dad and stepmom, when they had Comcast and Xfinity, lo and behold, out of nowhere, they decided to put on the Blob from the 50s on there, and I sat down and watched it, and I really was not impressed. I was actually kind of disappointed. It wasn't as good as I hoped/thought it would be. But another exposure I had to the Blob is I read the Crestwood House book on the Blob, and it of course talked about the original and the remake. And then going back to Alien Invaders, yeah, I watched the comparison between the original and the remake really stuck out to me. And then not long after that, I watched some clips from the film, and it really got me intrigued. But it escaped me, and then 6 or 7 years later, I bought the movie on DVD. Actually, no, it was even longer than that. When I was working back at Murphy's, I bought this movie on a whim on DVD, and I sat down and I watched it, and I was very pleasantly surprised. I really dug the shit out of this movie, and I've seen this movie about 5 times, and it remains the same. It's a favorite, always has been. I've seen quite a few reviews of this film, of course, and it seems to be pretty positive. I've yet to see somebody come out and say they out and out dislike this movie. The Blob, of course, was released in 1988, being, of course, a pretty close remake to the original film. It was released again in August in 1988, and it was unfortunately a box office bomb, grossing 8.2 million against a 10 million budget. I mean, that could be worse, but still, yeah, it flopped. And though it received a mixed response from critics, the film has garnered a cult following in the years since its release. So is the original Blob. I'll talk about that if I ever do review the original Blob. Um, and yeah, this movie does have a cult following. I've seen a lot of people say they really like this movie. I haven't really seen any haters. I've seen some that say they prefer the original, but I haven't seen anybody out and out say that they hate this film. So that's good. You're never going to let me live that one down, are you, Sean? Enough with the fish. So with all that being said, let's get into the plot of the original Blob. Or not the original, the Blob remake. I'm just all over the place, can't you tell? A meteorite crashes near Arborville, California, although ironically this movie was shot in Louisiana. An elderly transient discovers within this sphere a massive slime mold-like substance that adheres to his hand, seemingly having a mind of its own. 3 high school students, Brian, Meg, and Paul, take him to a hospital after smashing into him with a car. After Brian leaves, Paul witnesses the lower half of the transient melting from exposure to the Blob. As he calls for help, the Blob drops on top of him, and Meg arrives to see Paul being devoured by the growing Blob. While she tries freeing him, his arm melts off, and Meg is thrown against the wall and knocked unconscious. And then the Blob fully dissolves Paul, and it oozes out of the hospital and into the surrounding woods. Gnarly monster. As the Blob moves through the woods, it encounters Scott and Vicky necking in Scott's car, and it consumes both of them in a gnarly, gory display of great practical effects. After Brian and Meg have unsatisfactory encounters with the police, they meet at a diner where Meg tells Brian about the Blob. Brian's disbelief is shattered when the diner's handyman is pulled through a sink drain by the Blob. It pursues them into the diner's walk-in freezer, but the Blob retreats after feeling the extreme cold of the water. After consuming the diner's owner, Fran Hewitt, and the sheriff Geller, played by Dale from The Walking Dead, Jeffrey DeMunn, the Blob re-enters the sewers, seen by an intoxicated Reverend Meeker. Ugh, this guy. The Reverend goes into the now abandoned diner and finds a few small crystallized shards of the Blob that were left behind when it tried to enter the freezer, and he places them in a sealable glass jar. Meg and Brian return to the police station where the dispatcher tells them that Deputy Briggs is near the meteor landing site. They discover a military operation led by a scientist, Dr. Meadows, who orders the town and the 2 teens quarantined. While Brian escapes, Meg is taken to town where she learns her younger brother, Kevin, is missing. Missing from the last review, a word from our sponsor. Oh, that's good. Meg learns her younger brother, Kevin, is missing. Meg learns he and his friend Eddie sneaked into the movie theater where a slasher film that's totally parodying Friday the 13th is playing. The Blob enters the theater in a great recreation of the iconic theater runout scene from the original Blob and attacks the staff and audience. Meg arrives as the audience flees the theater, rescuing Eddie and Kevin. Brian eavesdrops on Meadows and Jennings talking and learns that the Blob is actually a biological warfare experiment created during the Cold War and launched into space because it was so dangerous. Learning that the Blob has entered the sewers, Meadows decides to trap it there. Meadows, I should say, not my wife. Even if that means allowing Meg, Kevin, and Eddie to die. Brian is discovered listening in and evades military personnel by driving his motorcycle into the sewers. In the sewers, Meg and Kevin flee from the Blob when it emerges and, in a very ballsy fashion, consumes the child Eddie. Kevin escapes by scaling a pipe to the surface, and Meg is saved by Brian, who confronts Meadows in front of the townsfolk and Deputy Briggs. After failing to convince everyone Brian is contaminated and must die, Meadows attempts to shoot him, but is killed by the Blob as it oozes into his chemical suit and drags him into the sewer. The Blob breaches the sewers to the surface and begins feasting upon the population. It proves impervious to the military's attempts to stop it, killing Colonel Hargis and multiple others. Reverend Meeker proclaims the scene to be the prophesized end of the world, after which a failed flamethrower attack on the Blob sets him ablaze. Meg saves him with a fire extinguisher and in the process blasts the Blob with it. When the monster backs off, she realizes that the Blob cannot tolerate cold, also taken from the original movie. The survivors retreat to the town hall and hold the Blob off with furniture barricades and fire extinguishers. But it is a losing battle as the Blob engulfs half the building and devours Briggs, very violently breaking him in half and hauling him off. Brian goes to the town's garage and gets a snowmaker truck that has canisters of liquid nitrogen attached. As the Blob is about to consume Meg and her family, Brian shoots snow at the creature, which is angered and knocks the truck over. As the Blob surges toward Brian, Meg lures it away from him and towards the canisters, which she has rigged with an explosive charge taken from a dying, half-melted soldier. She tries getting clear, but snags her foot between two pieces of cliché, trapping her. Brian regains consciousness and runs over to free her. The Blob is about to overrun them when the charge goes off, blowing up the canisters and covering the Blob in liquid nitrogen. The creature is flash frozen into a mass of crystallized pieces. Moss Woodley, the guy who owns the snow truck, has its remains stored in the town ice house until the military can arrive with proper equipment and take it away. A few years later, at a tent church cult service meeting in a field, Reverend Meeker, disfigured by his burns and secretly driven insane, preaches a doomsday sermon resembling the Blob's attack. A parishioner enters his private area and asks him when the end will come, and he says, "Soon, madam, soon. The Lord will send me a sign." And in a really bad composite prop shot is revealed that he has kept the piece of the Blob still trapped inside the glass jar and that it has thawed out, leading into a potential sequel that I have no idea if it's ever been attempted to be made, but most likely will never ever happen. Sadly. Okay. So how about this plot? Well, kind of like with Fright Night as well. Okay. How about this plot? It is very similar to the original movie, but it is changed around in areas to A, make it feel modernized, B, a big conspiracy theory movie about the government and how they would handle a outbreak of a red, pink, slimy, gooey, man-eating monster. It pays loving tribute to its original movie, but it does change enough material around to make it feel original and its own thing. And overall, I think it's quite well done. So the pros to the Blob, I have I have, again, 10 pros. Though I'll start out, once again, pro number 1 is I listed it as great retooling. Like I said, the plot is very similar to the original movie. It, for one thing, it changes its 50s cheesy tone with an 80s cheesy tone. A lot of its characters are different, but still kind of similar. They're teenagers that are just out trying to have a good time and have fun. There's still that rebellious teenage element clashing with the police element. Um, there's some of that kind of Cold War conspiracy theory elements that are taken from the original and kind of doubled up in here. Um, like I wouldn't be surprised in the original Blob, there's people that say that the Blob in the original is like communism spreading to consume and infect everybody. Um, Also, kind of like with Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but not nearly as shoved down your throat like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Um, and the retooling of the Blob itself. In the original, it was just a straight up alien. It was an amorphous, red, bloodthirsty mass of space slime, to quote James Rolfe. Here, it's a man made monster uh, coming from the Cold War um, as a man made biological warfare experiment that went out of control. Still keeping to its sci-fi roots, but changing it around to A, modernize it, but also B, even more so, go into the conspiracy theory stuff with this movie. Um, I've seen some people like Steven here saying here it's man-made, whereas in the original it's an alien. I don't really have much of a problem. I think the man-made thing is another 80s modernization element, and if I actually do prefer that too, because had the Blob been an alien in this version, I think at that point is when the movie would have just felt too similar to the original. So changing the Blob to be man-made rather than an alien does change around a good chunk of the film. So that's good. What more on the Blob in a little bit, but I do like the retooling that they did. Again, it is very similar, but it's different enough to where it feels like its own movie. So that's good, and that's what a good remake should do. And pro number two, kind of like with Fright Night, is the fun 80s tone. Different from Fright Night. Fright Night is just an out and out fun movie. This movie takes itself a lot more seriously than something like Fright Night. It's actually trying to be scary and carnage galore candy and uh, carnage candy galore, excuse me, and gnarly and gritty. There's a couple scenes that are trying to be like mostly the theater scenes that are just kind of poking fun at the slasher craze that was going on at the time. Um, which that's all well and good. That still makes it feel very 80s. But the one thing this movie does that I really like, it very much so, like the original movie, conveys the small town aesthetic where everybody knows everybody. That's really done well in this movie, especially with the sheriff character. He really comes off like he knows everybody in this town. No, it's just a shame he gets killed off. Um, but overall, yeah, I like and I also like something that's also brought in from the original is an entire town coming together to fight a greater evil. I actually think it's better done in this movie because we literally do have an entire town trying to come together and fight back against an invading evil. Um, it's really nice and it's really well done in my opinion. So yeah, I like this movie's tone. Not like Fright Night. This movie is a lot more gritty and it's actually more in line with something like The Thing. Where it's just a group of people fighting back against a nasty amorphous alien invader. Though in this case it's not an alien, but you see what I mean. It is kind of similar. Yeah, I like this movie's tone. And it is 80s, but it's not nearly as 80s as something like Terminator or Fright Night. But yeah, I like this movie's tone. Pro number three is the cast. Now, the cast is honestly really nothing special. It's not like Fright Night where you get really attached to the main characters. The characters here are just like a couple steps above serviceable. They're all well acted and they're fun to watch, and you get attached to them as protagonists. And the antagonists too are also well done. Like Dr. Meadows is one massive, no pun intended, slime ball. He's just a little typical. He's like a evil, not really a mad scientist, but a crooked, corrupt, dickhead, mad scientist. And he gets a really good death, so that's good. The main character you really get attached to is Brian Flagg, or I'll just call him Flagg. He's another thing that reminds me, he's pretty much like a greaser from the 50s. He's got the leather jacket, he rides a motorcycle, he wears blue jeans, and he's got a mullet. He may as well be a greaser from the 50s. Um, he is also, in my opinion, kind of an underrated character, and this also goes into one of this movie's best aspects that actually Eric Harrison helped me notice when he reviewed this movie. Um, he's not your typical 80s male protagonist. At first, he comes off like kind of an asshole. Like he's kind of cold. He is very uninterested in everyone else's lives. He just kind of sticks out for himself and looks after himself. He's a bit gruff and just a bit standoffish and kind of a dick. Um, but he's like a far more scaled back version of kind of Captain Rhodes. He's an asshole, but he's a correct asshole. Because when he immediately smells a rat with all these government agents, and at first you think he's just trying to be a dick, but upon closer examination, Brian realizes that he was right. Um, and he is obviously at one point a juvenile delinquent, and when he's actually trying to be legit and stay out of trouble, of course, just people are prejudiced against him. But in the end, he does prove himself to be a very capable guy, especially in fighting back against the Blob and the military personnel. And he knows how to. Another thing too is that he knows he's very intuitive because he's the first one that notices, along with Meg too. But he's the first one that notices the Blob doesn't like the cold. Um, and the first thing that he does, well, he doesn't know this at this point, but he just runs for shelter, and that of course happens to be the freezer. And he pays attention when the Blob retreats from the cold. He's also good with his motorcycle, and he's good with his hands because he knows how to use tools and be a mechanic. Um, Hang on one sec. Anyway, sorry, my nephew wants to come over. Um, yeah, I like Brian Flagg. He's a good protagonist. Meg, played by Shawnee Smith from Saw fame, is at first kind of a stereotypical damsel in distress, and a couple times she is, but toward the end of the movie, she really tries to. And also, at first, she comes off like she's just the hot ditzy cheerleader that everybody wants to bone, but she ends up with the degenerate, you could say, for lack of a better term. But she also tries to be badass in saving her brother and also taking up a gun and trying to fight back against the Blob. Not much to say about Meg, but she is a likable character, and she's not annoying, certainly, which is good. But other than that, the cast is just a little bit more than serviceable. They're fun, they're 80s, they're likable. It's like, again, that part of that small town aesthetic that's easy to like. They're not amazing by any means, but they're certainly a good cast. Um, Pro number 4 is the suspense. There's a lot more suspense in this movie. Although this movie certainly does favor gore and carnage candy, which is good, but there are some moderately suspenseful moments. There's lots of good, little reminiscent of Jaws, where they do a good job of showing the Blob's point of view, where it's stalking around town in the sewers and hiding in the shadows and striking when it when you don't expect it. Yeah, there's some all right suspense. There's some all right suspense in this movie. Not much to say, but it's done. It's well done. Um, Pro number 5 is what I call the subversion tactics. This movie is very atypical. This is what Eric Harrison pointed out to me. This movie likes to subvert expectations, a little bit like Psycho. The main character, I think, what was his name? Paul. Yeah, Paul. Um, at first, you think that Paul and Meg are going to be this movie's item, and Brian is going to be the asshole antagonist of this movie. But about 25 minutes in, Paul is eaten by the Blob. And then after that is when Brian becomes the main character. So you're like, oh, okay. I thought he was going to be the main character. And he dies. Okay. Meg herself, too, is a subversionary tactic. Like I said, she starts out as just the hot, ditzy cheerleader, but then she morphs into kind of a badass toward the end of the movie, which is great. And also, you don't expect her to get with the transient. You expect her to get with, or not the transient, the delinquent. And then you expect her to get with Paul, but then, Paul dies, and then Meg goes to Brian, and Brian you think is going to be the asshole. He is the asshole, but then he turns into the hero. And another thing, too, which is ballsy, this movie kills off a kid in a very gnarly display of practical effects. Yeah, and also, at first you're thinking, because the Blob crash lands in what looks like a meteor, you think, oh, the Blob is an alien again. But then halfway through the movie, nope, the Blob's man-made. It's like, oh, okay. Again, it's really good at subverting your expectations and surprising you with the new stuff that it does, which I think is really cool. Pro number 6 is the Blob itself. This monster is gnarly. This is despite the fact it's literally just a blob of slime, you really get the sense that this thing has a mean, nasty, sadistic personality. It is just a gnarly, bloodthirsty, man-eating monster. And this fucker is not to be fucked with. I love this monster. It's such an underrated monster. And it's so simple, but at the same time, so much is done with this thing to make it feel so threatening and so scary, honestly. Like this fucker is scary, in my opinion. This will lead me into pro number 7 is the special effects in this movie are fantastic. 7, 8, and 9 all pretty much have, 6, 7, 8, and 9 all pretty much have to do with each other. The Blob itself, the fantastic practical special effects, the really gnarly ass kills, and the fantastic gore in this movie. I don't know much about the special effects, but according to the production, the special effects in the film were handled by a guy named Tony Gardner. He worked on Zombieland, 127 Hours, Smoking Aces, The Addams Family, Seed of Chucky, just name a few. Gardner was originally supposed to provide only a few small effects, with Lyle Conway originally being in charge. However, after personnel changes, he ended up running a crew of 33 people. In creating the titular blob creature, the special effects team used silk bags filled with methyl cellulose, which is a chemical compound derived from cellulose, which is a thickening agent for food. It's like a modified cornstarch, creating what the team described as a blob quilt. And they like fold and pull and stretch and mold and morph literally the Blob into various shapes and sizes throughout the film. It was like a pinkish red color, though toward the end of the movie, it's a much reddish color, like the original Blob. And same in both movies, it starts out looking kind of pinkish clear color, and then as it gets bigger and as it absorbs people, it grows in size and becomes more reddish pink. Though in the original, it's just out and out red, where it's here, it's like a pinkish red. Um, but yeah, and also they also apparently use some stop motion effects here too, which those look cool, and they use a lot of composite and blue screen effects to like have the Blob quilt and the main characters be on screen at the same time. But they also use a lot of puppet, rod, wire, and animatronic effects too. Like when the Blob shoots out tentacles to try to snag somebody, it's like a piece of the Blob that's pulled out by a wire, or it has like animatronic tentacles. Or when one really gnarly kill, when a projectionist is like dissolved and the Blob is on the ceiling, and it's like a half dissolved, half melty dude that's being assimilated by the Blob. Again, looks kind of reminiscent of the Thing, which really makes me wonder, how the hell would the Thing assimilate the Blob? That'd be really cool. The Blob versus the Thing. Make that a movie. Somebody make that a movie. But yeah, the special effects are really, really solid. A lot of the composite shots look really good. The stop motion looks really good. The animatronics look really good. The gore is phenomenal, and the kills are just gnarly as fuck. The Blob is one brutal ass sadistic monster. Everybody dies a horrible, horrible, gnarly, nasty death. The first kill you see is the dude who literally just gets half melted by the Blob. The second one, when Paul gets flopped on, and as it's pulling itself out and absorbing Paul, what's really kind of freaky is that Paul at first is like screaming inside of the Blob, but then eventually the Blob just starts melting and pulling on his flesh and bones, and like pulls his face apart. And then they also showcase that the Blob is very acidic. It may as well just be a blob of stomach acid, pretty much, that somehow has a mind of its own. The next kill is when Vicky and what's his name? What's his name? Oh, Vicky and Scott. Vicky passes out, probably because Scott roofied her, and he's about to start molesting her. But then the Blob's tentacles start shooting out and wrapping around Scott's arm, and that's when we realize Vicky's been dead this whole time, and the Blob just kind of like forces its way out of Vicky's face and his body and her body, and just starts pouring all over Scott, and he tries to kick his way out, but you hear these like nasty, slurpy, melty, acidic sounds, and it's gnarly as fuck. One of my favorite shots in this whole movie is when after Meadows is killed, which first of all, the Blob just like forces its way through the small cracks in his suit and then shows up in his face and just pulls him and breaks him in half down the sewer. They shoot a whole bunch of rounds down in there and they toss a few grenades. But then as Flagg says, I think you pissed it off. It shoots its way out and it's bigger than ever and then just comes crashing down on one of the colonels and just demolishes him. And there's another scene too where the Blob like shoots out a big lump of an arm and it just crashes down on one innocent bystander, flattens it, and then it peels its hand up and absorbs the body into its body. And then the most shocking kill of the whole movie is when Eddie gets killed. Eddie gets pulled underwater in the sewers. Meg jumps in after him. she gets out, but then in a really good jump scare, a half dissolved, almost ironically, because this actor plays in this movie, kind of looking like Emil at the end of the toxic waste guy at the end of RoboCop. And that guy who plays Emil is also in this movie. And he gets broken in half by the Blob. Which that's another gnarly kill because the sounds are really visceral and nasty. Yeah, Eddie jumps out half melted and dissolved, and he lets out this garbled, distorted shriek, and then he's just pulled in and consumed. And no, my favorite kill in the whole movie, I think this is the gnarliest kill, is the dude who sucked down the diner sink. It's plugged and he's trying to unplug it, and he reaches his hand down, he pulls out just a little piece of the blob, then all of a sudden what looks like a blobulous hand shoots its way out and grabs the dude's head and the sink drain is maybe about that big around, and it just pulls him down and crushes his head and crushes his body until you hear just this loud sound, and then you think he's gone, and then just shoots out of the sink and pools on the ceiling. It's such a gnarly, visceral, nasty kill. And this will lead me into like the second to last pro is the gore. This movie is bloody, nasty, visceral, and violent. All of the kills are brutal and gritty and sadistic as fuck. There's lots of blood. There's lots of guts and gore and ooze and slime. It's so gnarly and so nasty and so fun to watch. If you're a big gore hound and you like gritty, violent, nasty kills, this movie is right up your alley. And the last pro that I have is the fun action / chase scenes. I really dig them. There's lots of... Hang on a sec. This is taking an eternity. All the scenes where the characters are running away from the blob and trying to avoid getting absorbed, they're a lot of fun. They're well edited. They're well choreographed. They're certainly intense. And especially after seeing what the blob does to you, oh, okay. Thanks, Eric. Seeing what the blob does to you when it gets its slimy hands on you definitely makes the chase scenes a lot more intense and gritty and more entertaining. Overall, yeah, and there's lots of use of guns, even though they're not effective. Like they try quite a bit to take down the blob. They use grenades, rocket launchers, M16s, flamethrowers. None of it works. And often it ends in disastrous results. The dude who is using a flamethrower, the blob, like sends out a piece of itself and plugs the flamethrower barrel, causing the flamethrower to explode, which lights both the Reverend and the guy who's using it ablaze. Everyone who tries to shoot at it, they get assimilated and crushed and stomped and wrapped in tentacles and absorbed. The dude who threw the grenades, he just gets crushed. The main officer dude, he gets melted. His deputy, he gets broken in half by the blob. There's fun action scenes in this movie. They're well done, and there's some great kills, and they're gnarly and gross and sadistic as fuck. Yeah, if you're a big gore hound, this is a fairly simple movie. If you haven't been able to tell, it's just a straight up monster movie, but it certainly has an effective monster, and if that's well done, then you're in good hands. So with all these great things to say about this movie, do I have any cons? I have 2 cons and 1 nitpick. So I'll start with the nitpick. I will say that this movie is kind of unevenly paced. Mostly the first act is just a little slow. It does good at like setting up the characters, setting up the town and the small town aesthetic, which that's all well and good. But there's not a whole lot happens until the Blob shows up. And it takes a little while for the Blob to start running around and killing people. Although once he kills Paul, there's a good consistent body count all throughout the rest of the movie. So it's really just the first act that is just a little slow. But if you're patient enough, once it gets going, the going's good. So it's not a huge problem. Just you kind of have to sit in there. And that's another thing, too, that makes it feel like a classic 50s monster movie. The first acts of those movies tended to be kind of slow anyway, like with Beast and 20,000 Fathoms. So that's not a really very good that's not a very good example because that movie takes way too long to get going. But still, it's a similar aesthetic. But my first con, actually, these have to do with each other. Con number 1 and 2 is the Reverend character and the ending. The ending is super sequel bait, and it begs for a part 2. Like, I would love to see a giant blob running through a big city and just absorbing people left and right. It almost could, again, be like a kaiju version of John Carpenter's The Thing. So yeah, that would be cool. But yeah, this movie's ending is super sequel bait. And it's really frustrating and kind of leaves a bad taste in my mouth whenever I watch this film. It's just like, oh, come on, please. You're begging for a sequel. Why didn't you ever make, well, this movie bombed, but still, you're begging for a sequel. It's not super bad. It's not like Terminator Genesis or anything like that, but it is kind of frustrating. But then there's the Reverend character. Why is this guy here? This movie does not need to have some bullshit ass force down your throat religious subtext whatsoever. There's no way in hell the Blob is a prophesized end of the world judgment doomsday. This is totally forced, totally comes out of nowhere, and does not fit with this movie whatsoever, in my opinion. Whenever the Reverend is on screen, the movie really suffers because not only is it forced, but he's also annoying. Yeah, I don't like this Reverend guy. And the ending is just it's like forced religious cult shit. Like, oh, the Blob is the end of the world. Shut up. Overall, though, that's all I really have to say about the Blob. I guess I didn't have as much to say about it as I thought. Well, like I said, it's a simple movie. If you just want an 80s monster movie, that has a really good monster and a really good body count and some really great effects and kills, and that's all that you want, this movie is right up your alley. It's a very well-made movie. It's a great remake. It pays respects to its roots, but it also does its own thing and creates its own identity, which is really, really nice and really cool. Overall, I will be giving this movie a very, very strong 8 out of 10. It's a fun movie. It's very entertaining. If you like your gritty, violent, dark monster movies, you'll love this movie. So post your comments down below. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button and hit the subscribe button and share this video with your friends. And as always, if you're in the sewers for some reason and you see a giant amorphous blob of pink goo running towards you, run and grab a fire extinguisher. And I will see you guys in the next video.